Welcome back. My name is Sam Hassel, and in today's episode, we are going to be doing a deep dive case study analyzing the 2025 to 2026 application cycle early acceptances at one of America's most well-known and highly regarded high schools. Even more so and more significantly, particularly going to dive into a lot of the driving nuances in terms of these acceptances, a lot of hidden patterns in terms of what may have contributed to these students' acceptances that not a lot of people talk about or really analyze. We've done this before in terms of looking at another extremely, prestigious and well-regarded high school in Harvard Westlake, and we talked a lot about the various hooks, not academic hooks per se, but legacy, athletic recruitment, and other forms of sort of strategic nuances that may be responsible for students ultimately gaining admission. And so when we look at a school such as Exeter and we sort of look at the admissions data, it's very easy. Very often people will just sort of say, oh, they have all these acceptances, and they just sort of attach those to the school's name. And certainly these are all likely to be very impressive students. And Exeter is, of course, a great school, but I want to really dive into a lot of the sort of other nuances that potentially contribute to these acceptances and shed light on those nuances. So people can sort of see the extra potential advantages that these students have at these colleges and in terms of gaining acceptances for a whole host of different reasons. I also want to shed light on some of these strategic advantages that you can potentially also make use of in your own candidacy or your student's own candidacy, and sort of show a little bit of what may make some of these students stand out that is actually potentially, somewhat controllable as well for all of you. So let's dive in. I'm going to give some background on Exeter, then going to go into the actual admissions results to date in the various early rounds as of early February. And then I'm going to discuss some of these nuances, some of these little extra sort of hooks, or these various forms of strategic positioning, whether they were intentional or not intentional. And then we are going to arrive at several strategic takeaways from this data. Okay, so let's kick things off. What is Phillips Exeter Academy? So it is located in Exeter, New Hampshire. It was established in 1781. It is a private boarding school, and it is the sixth oldest boarding school in the United States. It has an endowment of over $1.6 billion last reported, and that would place it among the highest endowments, even if it were a college. So it has a higher endowment than all but about 50 colleges in the United States as just a high school. It ranks number one in the 2026 Best College Preparatory Private High School rankings, according to Niche. Its alumni include U.S. President Franklin Pierce, politician Daniel Webster, Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg, novelist John Irving, and author Dan Brown. It was the high school of over 35 U.S. Congresspeople, 6 U.S. governors, 3 Medal of Honor recipients, and 3 Nobel Prize winners. In terms of the high school class of 2026 at Exeter, there are 329 seniors that will be about to graduate and that are currently going through the 2025-2026 application cycle. We're going to be looking at self-reported early acceptance data, as I mentioned, as of early February 2026 from the official Exeter Decisions page on social media, again, for the high school class of 2026 at Exeter. So we are going to define here. We're going to be particularly looking at top college acceptances since that's what we focus this podcast on. And so again, we will define a top college as in earlier episodes as a top 20 national or research university according to the U.S. News rankings. There are several colleges that are tied at number 20 in those current rankings. So This will sort of encompass about 23 or so schools, so roughly, top 20 to top 25 national research universities. We're going to look at the number of acceptances, and then we're going to do a deep dive in terms of a lot of these strategic nuances that I discuss a lot on the podcast that make a student more rare, basically earn them more candidacy points, as I've mentioned, and further help to drive their scarcity in the applicant pool by giving the college something that is institutionally valued in some way. And we're going to discuss some of those various factors. So, as of where we stand right now in early February, there have been 31 total acceptances at Exeter to colleges that we've labeled top colleges or in the top 20 national research universities and US News rankings. So 31 out of 329 seniors, a little bit less than 10%. Obviously, the application cycle is not completed yet. This is, again, just from some of the early rounds where we currently stand. So we have 31 total acceptances to top colleges. 4 of those are from students who are underrepresented minorities. 4 are for students who are athletic recruits. We then have 3 who are an underrepresented gender in terms of their major that they applied for at the college. 11, and this is the big category, 11 had a form of gender advantage at the school overall. And what that means, as we've discussed in prior episodes, what that means is if you look at the data and the number of acceptances versus the number of applicants for males versus females or females versus males, there is one gender that receives a pretty significant advantage in terms of the acceptance rates at the college. Right, so we've given some numbers for schools in the past. We've done some case studies of, if you're applying to Yale or Brown or schools where boys are particularly more underrepresented. If I don't remember exactly off the top of my head, I want to say that in our Yale deep dive episode that we did this past summer, I believe off the top of my head that at Yale, it is roughly 1 in 30 to get in as a female and 1 in 22 to get in as a boy. We're looking at schools basically here where there's a significant disparity in terms of odds of admission for one gender versus another. And so, again, 11 of the 31 admits so far had some form of gender advantage at the overall institution. And then we have one student who was from an underrepresented country, a country that is not very often represented in terms of sending students to top colleges. In total, there were 23 different cases here out of 31 overall acceptances as top colleges. 23 had some form of extra, what I'll say is sort of some extra scarcity factor or something that was institutionally valued that again drove the scarcity of the student's case, right? Above and beyond any academics or testing or extracurriculars, right? This would have made them more rare in the applicant pool in a way that would be valued by the college. So 23 out of 31, that is 74%, had some additional driving scarcity factor, basically, or something that is valued, right? And you can sort of, in some way, we can sort of say that all of these ultimately amount to being underrepresented. So if you are an underrepresented minority, of course, that's the one that everybody sort of talks about and sort of refers to as underrepresented. But if you're an athlete, well, there's probably nearly all of the students who are coming to the college probably play a sport in some form or another. However, if you are a recruited athlete, your ability is, so to speak, underrepresented. It's at a fairly extreme level in terms of the students who go on to attend the college, and you could sort of say that your level of ability, your level of athletic talent is underrepresented, right, in terms of the incoming class. If you're a legacy, you could say your family relation to the college is underrepresented in terms of the incoming class. A lot of this ultimately does come down to being underrepresented or being more rare or being more scarce in some way that the college deems institutionally valuable, right? That's really what it all boils down to. Again, in 23 cases here, there was at least there were 23 different instances of a student either being underrepresented minority, being an athlete, being in a underrepresented gender in a given major or field at that college, being underrepresented or having a gender advantage at the school overall, or being from an underrepresented country. And so again, 74%. In terms of the total unique number of students who had some form of advantage, as I've defined it, because there were students who had several different strategic advantages. 18 out of the 31, or 58%, had some form of advantage. Again, underrepresented minority athletes, underrepresented gender in terms of the major, some sort of gender advantage in terms of the overall college and its applicant pool versus admit rate for male versus female or female versus male. And then again, underrepresented country was 1 student. And so we have 18 out of the 31, or 58% of the students had some form of extra advantage. And very notably, I am not factoring in legacy here at all, because in this data set, we don't have access to which students were or were not legacy. However, given that Exeter is a very prominent private school, private boarding school, we can be sure that there's very likely to be a non-trivial number of legacy admits in this data, but we do not have access. So when we say 58% of these students out of the 31 had some extra advantage, that does not even include legacy, which, again, would probably be non-trivial. Okay, let's discuss some of the positioning here. So positioning refers to the way that you apply to the college, and in some cases it refers to basically your strength as an applicant versus the institution's strengths, or your strength versus their weakness, or your weakness versus their strength, and sort of looking at it in terms of a dynamic of sort of how well pitted, how well positioned your candidacy is given the school's particular applicant pool and its particular offerings and what it is either strong in or weaker in. So if we look at some of these positioning factors, only 8 out of the 31 admits applied directly into an institutional strength of the college that they were admitted to. And so what do I mean by institutional strength? I mean that this is something the college is, very well known for. So this would be something like political science areas at Georgetown, or business at Wharton, Penn, or CS at Stanford, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, pre-med at Johns Hopkins. These are areas that we generally, say are, this school is excellent in these areas, and many students who are interested in these areas, particularly seek out these colleges because of the renown in that particular field, right? And so only 8 out of the 31, a small number, small percentage, actually applied directly into the institutional strength without having any other sort of maybe potentially more advantageous positioning. In terms of major, 8 out of the 31 applied for a field that would be considered an undersubscribed major. So there are some students who applied for a few different things. 8 out of the 31 had at least one major interest that would be considered an undersubscribed major. And as I refer to it, a hard mode admit. So a hard mode admit basically is, so of course, when you're applying to top colleges, they're all extremely selective, in the first place, and very difficult to get into as it is. But a hard mode admit is a student who is a overrepresented minority. It's even harder for them to get into. So these are Indian, Asians, in particular. They then may also be overrepresented in terms of the field. So this would be thinking, an Indian female who's interested in studying some pre-med field, at a school that is very well known, institutionally very strong. So again, such as Johns Hopkins, or if you had an Asian boy who's interested in studying CS at Stanford or MIT, or Carnegie Mellon. This is basically where you have stacked levels or stacked layers of difficulty. You have a student who's overrepresented ethnically or by their race. They're overrepresented in terms of their gender in the field. And then they're applying directly into an institutional strength, right? A school that is extremely well known for that area. Uh, it's notable that there are 0 that we have in this self-reported data set. There are no students who got into, again, CS Stanford, Johns Hopkins pre-med that are significantly overrepresented. And we will discuss, there's one case where you can sort of see a little bit of strategic positioning where the student actually positioned into a bit of a very popular field, but not necessarily an institutional strength for that particular top college we will get into. So again, 8 out of the 31, only 8 out of the 31 applied into an institutional strength. 8 out of the 31 applied for particularly undersubscribed majors. So most sort of, if you look at most of the data, a lot of students were sort of somewhere, in the middle. Very few applied for, again, directly into, a field that was the strongest or that school is particularly well known for. There were some cases where students did apply for something that was undersubscribed, but a lot of them sort of sit in the middle somewhere. And then, as I said, there are no students who, at least in this data, according to this data set, got in having this very difficult path that some students take where they're applying to one of the top colleges, but then they're overrepresented in potentially multiple ways, race, ethnicity, potentially gender in a field. And then they're applying into a particular field that the school is the strongest in. And that, again, is going to be the absolute hardest path in all of the missions. It is basically climbing Mount Everest, but then taking the most difficult trail up to the top and then having to do it on your hands. Okay, so let's draw some takeaways here. So this is a very, very limited data and limited data set. And so I want to sort of draw just some surface level conclusions here and, some different inferences and takeaways for people. So again, 18 out of 31 students, or 58%, were underrepresented or hooked, so to speak, in some way, right? And so some of these factors people don't traditionally consider to be hooks or non-academic hooks, like legacy. A lot of people, will consider legacy to be a hook or being an athlete, but they don't typically think of, being, having a gender advantage at a particular college. This is something that's become more prominent in terms of people's awareness in recent years. They're not thinking as much about being maybe underrepresented in terms of, gender by your major. And so, if we sort of broaden this out a little bit, for the different categories that we included above. So again, underrepresented minority, athlete, underrepresented in terms of your gender for a specific major, having a gender advantage overall of the institution, or being from an underrepresented country. If we sort of expand it out a little bit, we don't have legacy data again, but for those various factors, we have, again, 58% of the students who were accepted had one of those extra advantages. 24 out of 31, or 77%, once we take into account some positioning factors. So that would be that they applied for an undersubscribed major, or they applied into a school's weakness, a field that they're not particularly strong in. If we take those positioning, those advantageous positioning strategies, whether they were strategies, whether students were doing them intentionally or not doing them intentionally, and then we layer that on top of the students who have the aforementioned advantages of being underrepresented, or a gender advantage, or an athlete, or underrepresented minority, 77%, 24 out of 31, had some type of advantage. Again, it could be positioning, it could be undersubscribed major, it could be a field that the school isn't particularly strong in. athlete, underrepresented minority, gender advantage, any form of additional advantage. And again, this does not even include legacy. So this 77% number could possibly be closer to 90%, right? So it is a lot, right? And one of the fundamental points that I want to make here is I'm not, saying these students only got in because of these factors. But when you are talking about the most selective colleges, you need to be fundamentally rare in a way that is valued by the college. And if you have these extra boosts, these serve on top of your core candidacy, basically to make you more rare and to help you stand out at these colleges, right? And so they are very important nuances that many people often do not take into account as much as they need to. Now, so there were 24 out of the 31, 77%, as I said, who had some form of extra advantage on top of whatever the rest of their candidacy was, right? And we don't have these students' resumes or their main, academic hooks or their academics or testing. We don't have any of that, right? These are purely just sort of surface level additional advantages that these students would have. Now, for the other seven, so there's 24 to 31 where they had some form of additional advantage. The seven who did not, out of the 31, the 23% who did not have any extra sort of advantage as we defined it, none of them were admitted to a top 5 college, right? So there were 4 students who were admitted to Harvard from Exeter. All of them had some additional driving factor. 2 of them were athletic recruits, right? So out of the 7 who didn't have something else pushing their candidacy to help it, none of them were admitted to top 5 colleges, and almost none of them were admitted to top 10 colleges. Most of them were admitted to schools that I would say are roughly top 15 to top 20-ish, right? And so a little bit more towards the bottom end of the range of what we've defined as a top college. And this does sort of make sense with what we've described, which is at the very top. So when you go from top 20 to top 10, top 5, there's going to be the greatest amount of pressure on you to be, scarce and unique and rare, whether that is through your talent, your ability, being, national level or world class or absolutely exceptional in something, or whether it's you just are, extremely rare in terms of your interest, or it's both. But there is going to be the greatest amount of pressure at the schools as you sort of move up, right? As you move from top 20 to top 10 to top 5, right? And so it does make quite a bit of sense, and it does sort of concord with some of our other, sort of hypotheses on this podcast, that the students basically who had no additional advantages, very often sort of on average got into schools that were towards the lower end of the spectrum in terms of top colleges, right? There were maybe 1 or 2 colleges that were maybe right on the cusp of sort of top 10. But a lot of them, again, on average, were more top 15 to top 20 for the 7 students who didn't have anything else additional in terms of these strategic nuances that would have made them more rare on top of their core candidacy. It is noteworthy as well that from this data set, from these 31 acceptances at top colleges, these students rarely applied into an institutional strength at these colleges, right? And so again, when you apply into an institutional strength at a top college, you have the top college part where that's already highly selective and difficult to get in, right? But then when you're applying into a field that the school is very well known for, all right, that invites a subsegment of the applicant pool. It's going to invite the students who all are the best in that field, right? And so you get compounding layers of difficulty, right? Like I've said with my analogy, it's like basically trying to scale Mount Everest. Maybe if you're scaling Mount Everest, I don't know a lot about scaling Mount Everest, but if there were a bunch of different paths, there might be some harder paths to scale Mount Everest, and then there might be some easier paths. If you are applying to a top college and you're applying for a field that the school is very strong in, it's basically like trying to scale Mount Everest, but you are picking one of the hardest paths to scale it, right? And so again, you get compounding levels and layers of difficulty, right? And so again, it is noteworthy out of these 31 self-reported acceptances so far to top colleges, it was very rare that students applied into an institutional strength. Now, the big exception, the one that drove where it was the case that several students did actually apply into an institutional strength at a top college in this data set was the University of Chicago for economics, right? So economics is, I would say, Chicago's, is well known for a few different things, but its economics department is widely considered, its most prestigious, well known department, and has long since been considered the best economics department in the world in academia. So there were, out of any of the students who did apply into an institutional strength, a large number of them were applying for econ at the University of Chicago, and there were eight admits at the University of Chicago. And as many of you likely know, this isn't too uncommon. There are several very well-known private schools, particularly in the Northeast, that do send a lot of students to the University of Chicago. Now, I will say that when for those students who did apply for econ at Chicago, there were several of them where they did actually apply to a top college in the University of Chicago, and then they also applied specifically into an institutional strength that was often offset strategically by other advantages those students would have had. So, for example, at the University of Chicago, many of the students who got in were boys. There is a significant statistical advantage given to boys versus girls at the University of Chicago, and so that's one advantage. There was a girl who applied for econ, and so she would have been significantly underrepresented in terms of the econ field. So even though that is an institutional strength of the University of Chicago, females are very underrepresented in terms of studying economics. And then, of course, we do have the general consideration here of these students were admitted early decision, right? And so University of Chicago is a school that is very, very big in terms of early decision. It has three different rounds of early decision. What's referred to as ED0, and then as ED1, and then as ED2, and it accepts an extremely small number of students outside of those three binding plans. And so, of course, they had that extra advantage as well. Now, in terms of some of the other students in this data set, so we talked about some very popular oversubscribed majors. One of them is engineering or CS. So it's notable that one of the students who did actually get into a top 5 college, he was overrepresented minority and got in for a very popular field. But he did so at an institution that is not very well known for STEM areas. And then there were another couple of students who also got in for engineering. And again, they also they positioned for a very popular field in terms of engineering, but at institutions that are not the most well known for engineering, right? And so there are no real, students who, they got in for engineering at one of the top engineering schools or STEM schools, or for CS at one of the top, CS programs, right? So again, this is noteworthy and important to sort of understand in terms of there are these great acceptances and a lot of these acceptances. But if you are, again, playing the game on hard mode or some form of hard mode and you don't have any of these advantages, you have to understand that this does change your odds of admission quite considerably. Or at the very least, it puts more pressure on the rest of your candidacy to be absolutely excellent because there has to be scarcity that is driven to a very large degree from the rest of your candidacy since you don't have it in terms of these additional factors. Okay, also noteworthy here as another takeaway, 10 of these 31 admits to top colleges from Exeter were interdisciplinary in terms of their positioning. So that means they had particularly interdisciplinary positioning in terms of their major interests. And some particularly noteworthy examples, and I think this is a pretty important takeaway for many people. A lot of people seem to confuse when we talk about having a focus and having a defined academic hook and a clear through line. They sort of take that to mean that the student is only interested or has only built a resume around one single discipline. And that is not what we mean at all, right? Many students who have a hook, it's an interdisciplinary hook, right? It sits at the intersection of two fields, sometimes maybe even three fields. And the student has sort of found a way to connect those fields in terms of their interests and their passions and how they've gone about pursuing those fields in their resume. There are also certain fields that are just naturally very interdisciplinary, right? So cognitive science would be a good example, right? That's a pretty interdisciplinary field just by its very nature. It includes neuroscience, psychology, some, computer science, some linguistics. And so there are just some fields that the student may be very focused in that field, but the field itself is naturally very interdisciplinary, right? And so I want to remind people that having a focus and having a hook, an academic hook, and a clear through line to your candidacy, it just means that it's a very coherent narrative. It doesn't mean that there's only one thing, right? That there's only one discipline, right? You could have a student who's very interested in solving a particular problem, but uses multiple disciplines and multiple disciplinary tools to go about solving that challenge, right? And it is very compelling and a very compelling academic hook to the colleges if the student actually does have a couple of different disciplines. um, but again, it's not that they are totally disparate, but very often they will tend to be tied together in some way, or the student will often sort of, maybe they have some more creative interest and they found a way to connect that to some other field that maybe isn't sort of on its surface, maybe doesn't seem as creative, such as theater and neuroscience. And this can be extremely compelling. And certainly in this data set, you did actually see several students where this does appear to either, again, intentionally, unintentionally, we don't know, but it was the case, right? And this again can help you to stand out as long as it doesn't come across as a very disparate narrative, right? That's sort of all over the place, right? And so we talk about well-rounded students and sort of well-rounded students not doing well at top colleges anymore. That doesn't mean a student who, has a couple of different disciplines where they built a really strong resume and it's an academically relevant resume. We're referring to a student who, again, they play a sport, they play an instrument. Very often, several of their pursuits, such as a sport, the instrument, will have nothing to do with their academic positioning, um, because they just are not going to play. They're not going to play a sport in college very often. They're not doing anything. They're not studying anything related to a sport. They're not doing anything academically in terms of studying music or partaking in that activity at the college. And so basically, it's just a sunk cost, right? And it's this notion of sort of just being well-rounded with these very common activities and then not really having any sort of academic relevance, or relevance more broadly speaking to what the student is going to study at the college or what they're going to bring to the college. A student who has possibly a couple of disciplines and they're academically relevant and their resume is academically relevant and it's well supported and they can even, especially if they can show a through line between these disciplines that may look different on the surface, but they can find some connection between them that can be extremely compelling and differentiating. So, some examples of this very interdisciplinary and very sort of interesting potential positioning. One student was neuroscience and linguistics and Chinese. Another student was math and classics. Notice how interesting that potentially is, right? There's sort of, this would go in two directions. One person might think that that's sort of very odd, right, to be math and classics. But if the student has clear and compelling evidence for both of these fields, And again, if they can particularly motivate any sort of connection, this is very unusual, right? And its unusualness is what will make it stand out, right? And so I've often said that a lot of standing out at top colleges is basically creating a prediction error in the brain of the reviewer, right? And so when you apply and you're an overrepresented minority in a field, right, or you're from a certain geographic area that disproportionately has a lot of students who study that field or whatever it is, or from a high school, and you have activities that are very congruent with that high school. You go to a magnet school, a STEM magnet school, and I see a bunch of the same typical STEM activities. There's nothing really that stands out, and there's no prediction error that's logged, right? The person reading that type of application has a certain model of the world, and this information is very consistent with that model of the world, right? And so it doesn't force that person to really take notice because it hasn't fundamentally broken their model of the world. And it hasn't created any sort of awe or surprise or intrigue or, oh, wait, what's this? This is weird. This is different. This is unusual. And that is often what is required to stand out, right? Is that sort of notion of snapping them out of that sort of boredom and that stupor that they're in of just reading application after application and them all blending together. Um, and so if you can log that prediction error, if you can be a student who's interested in math, but also classics, very weird, very different, potentially very interesting. You have my attention. That was another student. There was one who was business and philosophy. Also, again, very interesting, right? A student maybe is this, one of their lines might have been there, the Socrates of the stock market. What is this? Why are they interested in business, but then they're interested in philosophy? And unsurprisingly, they got into a top-notch business program. I think a lot of people interpret what I say on the podcast as, it has to be very linear, and I think that's a good starting place. And it's particularly a good starting place because if you're coming from the well-rounded notion, it's not linear at all. Like, it's not people aren't even thinking about building a resume for what you will study in college, right? And so it's totally nonlinear. So if you're coming from the well-rounded camp, just pushing you over to the notion of your resume should mirror what you basically are going to position for in terms of what you're going to do in college. Now you can obviously change it, but at least in terms of on paper in your application, the two need to be consistent. And that notion mostly has not existed, right? A lot of people just do activities and they play an instrument. It has nothing to do with what they'll do in college. They play a sport, it has nothing to do with what they'll do in college, right? And they have nothing really or very little that's academically relevant or, again, more broadly speaking, relevant to what they will do out of the college, right? And so if you're coming from that camp, just the notion of building a resume and pursuing things that are academically relevant and will be relevant to what you're telling the college that you will be doing when you get there, that is sort of like the first step, right? However, there are other people, and it's very common for many STEM students, engineering, computer science, where they don't really have as much of that problem. They do have the artifacts of being well-rounded, so they sort of have their STEM competitions and, all of their STEM activities, which are relevant to their college narrative. But then they also do all these they kind of add in some of these well-rounded artifacts, right? Like the music and, the whatever it is, the sport, etcetera, right? But generally speaking, they are very often, more pointy or more spiky than a lot of, students in general in the applicant pool. However, that comes with its own liabilities, which is not very unpredictable, right? A lot of these students who are interested in engineering, who do robotics and do the STEM competitions, it's very predictable. And it's even more predictable if you're a boy. It's even more predictable if you're Asian or Indian. It's even more predictable if you're from Silicon Valley or from certain areas or from a STEM magnet school or a school that's very strong in STEM, right? Where a bunch of the kids modeled behaviors of the other kids are from TJ, right? Thomas Jefferson. And so it's just not very predictable. It is good that they at least understand the linear nature of the high school resume being linear with the college. That's sort of what you're, selling to the college and sort of that future that future picture at the college. And so they've sort of gone from step 0 to step 1, but then they have other issues, which is very, again, very predictable. Some people don't quite, they sort of, again, they misinterpret the message as it needs to be very linear, but that can also backfire against you because linear also, to some extent, could be very predictable, right? So again, fascinating if you're doing math and classics, if you're doing business and philosophy. And again, ideally, doesn't absolutely have to be this case. I've talked about candidacies that are sort of bimodal in nature, which means they sort of have two hooks to them, right? But if the two hooks are sort of very well supported, they have their own different sets of activities. You have 3 or 4 activities that are high value for one of the hooks, and then you have 3 or 4 that are, pretty high value for the other one. You can take that bimodal approach, and it can be very effective. Generally speaking, we like to sort of make it as coherent as possible. And so we usually like to find nexus activities or glue activities, as I've called them, and sort of break down the walls of the two hooks and find some activities that, for example, for the business and philosophy students, some activities that would sort of subsume both of those areas and sort of make it even more coherent. So it's not just sort of like, again, two big spikes in a graph, right? But there's sort of something knocking down the walls of those two areas. Right, that's generally what we prefer because we generally tend to go for what is strategically and psychologically the most optimal, which is basically going to boil down to being the most coherent. And so we like to break down the walls if there's sort of two big passions and sort of find a way to connect them and glue them together. But it can work if you do sort of put them as being a little bit disparate, but you have again a set of pretty impressive activities for both of them. And then there was one student as well who was architecture and political science, right? And so again, fascinating. You could also find ways to connect those two areas and sort of tie them together with the architecture and the political science. So again, we don't know, we don't have any of the details, but on its surface, it looks possibly a little weird or disparate. But again, that is what sort of can register that prediction error and can motivate a very interesting application. And then we also had, particularly among some of these students who were interdisciplinary, several of them incorporated either classics or philosophy in their narrative. And so you do see some, pretty undersubscribed, majors and fields here also that made their way into the positioning strategies. Another takeaway, there were several students, maybe 5 or so in this data set, who were undecided in terms of their major or their field of interest. Now, this is something that, as many of you could probably gather from the podcast, is extremely uncompelling to admissions officers at top colleges. And so I do want to highlight here that pretty much all the students who were undecided were almost all of them were athletes. They were recruited athletes, right? And so if you see a student who got into a top college and they got in undecided, in some cases they just sort of change it in the way they report as undecided, but they did actually put majors in the application. They're just sort of saying that they don't actually know. But if they did actually apply undecided and they got into a top college, even working against that friction, there was something, and many times multiple things that were very compelling about them, right? Because being undecided is not compelling at all, right? Just imagine an admissions officer and they go to Tommy and they say, "Hey, Tommy, what do you want to study at our college?" Right? I saw that you put in an application. And Tommy says, "Yeah, I got nothing for you. I don't know. No idea." Right? That's not compelling at all. And so this process does significantly reward students who bring clarity to the process, at least in terms of what they put in their application. Doesn't mean you have to have made up your mind 100%, but saying you don't know is not compelling. And so this process disproportionately rewards clarity. It's much more psychologically easy on the admissions officer to not have to play, as I've said before, Sherlock Holmes and sort of, guess. It's hard for them to slot you in terms of the incoming class if they don't know exactly what you represent in terms of your interest or what department you would be in. right? And so the process rewards clarity and it rewards confidence and conviction, right? That if I give you this opportunity and if I give you one of these very valued spots, you will do something with it, right? Versus I have no idea what you'll do with it, right? And so if you come across one of these students who got in undecided to a top college and you sort of say, "Oh, look at this person." This is what a lot of people do, right? They say, "Oh, this person played 3 varsity sports and was a recruit athlete and they still got in." Well, I've said this to people before. Yeah, that's a lot of time. And that student also might get through their homework in 45 minutes, and it takes you 4 hours to get through your homework, and you don't have the extra time to play 3 varsity sports and still be able to pull it off, right? And so each case is unique. It has factors people don't know about that might have netted out to making the student rare enough or impressive enough at the college. It doesn't mean that we take everything the student did and we then sort of attribute causality and say, "Oh, this student got in, and so undecided, must be the strategy. You're playing 3 varsity sports." It could be that they got in despite that, not because of that, right? And so that's very common is people sort of misattribute the causality. Again, almost all the students who got in undecided, almost all of them were athletes except for one, right? I think it was 4 out of the 5 were athletes. Right? So don't do it is the main takeaway there. Do not do it. Do not apply undecided. Just pick the filter through which they'll see your application that is the strongest light that potentially we can put everything in your application under. And so there are going to be, if you've done anything, if you have a pulse and you have activities and you have grades and you have course rigor and you have test scores, there are going to be areas that are stronger and that sort of recur, right? There's going to be themes. There's often going to be themes. Some of them you might have to sort of creatively draw out from the data, but there are going to be areas that are stronger in your candidacy, and they're going to be themes that tend to repeat themselves more often than others. You want to position yourself very often in those ways, right? You don't want to just say undecided. If you are actually undecided on the back end, that's fine, but you need to not present that on the front end. Okay. And the final and most important takeaway here, as we've sort of gone through all of the data, again, 24 out of the 31 acceptances, right? Many people will sort of go through the data and they're sort of, this is what they do, right? They say, "Oh, look at this 31 acceptances at Exeter, right? Exeter, blah, 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 right?" 24 out of 31, almost 80%, and this does not factor in legacy at all. 24 out of 31 were either underrepresented minority, athletic recruits, underrepresented in terms of gender in their fields, had a gender advantage at the institution overall because there was some imbalance of male versus female applicant pool and admit rate, underrepresented country, applied into an institutional weakness or an undersubscribed major, right? 77% had some type of extra advantage driving and helping their candidacy, right? And so it's very important, again, to understand these extra strategic nuances and what I refer to as these stacked advantages, right? And so, okay, you have good grades and you took hard classes and you have good test scores, right? But so do most people, right? And so it's sort of, okay, well, what do you have on top of that? Okay, well, I have a defined academic hook. Okay, great, right? That gets you, to the next level, right? But then I have a gender advantage of the institution, right? And then I have an advantage in terms of the field that I applied for, right? And these are 2 extra advantages that the student who got to level 3 doesn't have. And guess who's gonna win? The student who has 5 advantages, not 3, right? And so I've talked about this again a lot in different case studies, these different demographic, institutional, candidacy nuances. But the students who are going to be the most rare stack advantages. Now, if you are literally the best in the world at something, you might not need any other advantages. But most people are not the best in the world at something, right? And so the way that they're going to need to arrive at the same degree of scarcity, right? The numbers have to add up to something. This is what I often say. If you want to go to X school, right? If you want to go to Stanford, you want to go to Columbia, you want to go to Cornell, it has to, your candidacy at the end of the day must add up to a certain number, right? And if everything in your candidacy with all the nuances adds up to 14, 14 doesn't equal 17. And so whether you get to 17 by 3 or 4 or 5 different, strategic means, or you hit a 17, in terms of your resume, let's just say, let's just sort of take out just the resume part or something, right? And so you hit a 17 on your resume, and you hit a 17 because you're just the best in the world at something, right? That the college actually cares about. You fundamentally need to be at some threshold and some level of being rare, right? And not just rare, but rare in a way that matters to the institution. And so, again, I refer to these as sort of stacked advantages. And when you have students who have, again, these multiple advantages, it's going to make them a much better candidate, right? And when you have other students, and we've seen this before, you get a student and they are valedictorian, they have a perfect test score, they have a really impressive resume, a really impressive hook, but they have no other advantages, right? They have no legacy. They're definitely not an athletic recruit. They're a white female applying into a field that's pretty popular at the college. They literally have nothing else. None of these advantages I'm talking about, right? Once you start going, right, you start getting into top colleges, that is a potential liability. And particularly once you move up and you go from top 20 to top 10 to top 5, it's not gonna fly usually, right? It's just not enough. The scarcity is not enough. If you're an international student and you're not a domestic student, much harder for you to get in, right? And so you're fighting an uphill battle, right? If you're uh, overrepresented minority, you're international, you're applying for a competitive field, you want to go to top 5 or top 10, not just any top 20, right? Again, you have stacked disadvantages, basically, right? And so that's gonna chip away and it's gonna eat away even if you have, again, perfect grades, amazing course rigor, perfect test scores, you have a great resume, you have a great hook, right? It still may not be enough and very often is not enough at a certain threshold of college, right? Where you just need to be even more rare than that. That's the biggest takeaway from this data and sort of why I did this case study is a lot of people are very simplistic. It's very easy because nobody's sort of diving into all the nuances and doing sort of a deep dive like this, and they sort of not looking at all these little factors, right, that actually do drive the acceptance data, right? So they're very lazy, right? They just say, oh, 31 got in from this high school, right? And it just becomes high school name attached to this number of kids getting in or this matriculation record, right? And it's not that simple. It's not that simple. There's no college application that's ever existed that the first name on the application says Phillips and the last name says Exeter, right? There's no college application that I've ever seen where on the application says first name Horace and last name Man, right? In terms of high school. There is no college application I've ever seen that says Harvard first name and last name Westlake, right? High schools do not apply to college. Students apply to colleges. And those students just happen to be bundled, and in some cases happen to have certain systematic similarities, right? There's a disproportionate number of legacies at certain schools. There's a disproportionate number of athletes at certain high schools. If it's a very selective private school, there's probably going to be a disproportionate number of students who have very high degrees of intellectual curiosity, right? And so it's not a lot of people, again, attribute these outcomes to the high school, right? And they don't actually look at the nuances, right? And so what I want to do is, again, is make people much more aware of all of these nuances, these different extra advantages that students may have. Now, would they have gotten in without them? We don't know. But as it turns out, again, nearly 80% had some form of extra advantage in this data. And again, that is not even including legacy, which would have likely driven the number even higher. Again, the school name often masks a lot of these other driving factors that people do not actually give their due and that do actually drive these outcomes and these results. Okay, that is it for this episode. Hopefully, everyone found this somewhat illuminating, and we'll talk soon in the next one. Bye bye.